Hello and welcome to episode 10 of Reflecting the Way Radio. I'm your host, Evan. Let's get started. Up first, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. You are listening to episode 10 of Reflecting the Way Radio, Saturn and an Ancient Alien Sky. If you haven't already done so, I would strongly encourage you to check the link out in the description box below for the associated article that goes along with this episode. I can almost guarantee you're going to want to use it for reference. I can also guarantee with some degree of certainty that you're probably going to want to read it more than once, and you're probably going to want to end up listening to this episode more than once. It is a fairly info-dense topic, and I'm assuming that this episode is going to be a fairly info-dense episode as well. We're going to move pretty quick, but before we do, I would also encourage you to check us out on Facebook, as well as Twitter. We are Reflecting the Way on Facebook and at Reflect the Way on Twitter. Both of those links are in the description box below. Also, don't forget to check out the website, reflectingtheway.com. You can find this show on the archive there if you missed it live, or if you're listening live and you would like to listen to it again, it can be found on Blog Talk as well as the audio resources page on the website. Okay. So I'm going to move fairly quick in this episode. I have to assume that there's some level of knowledge here, otherwise we'll be here all night. And I have a set amount of allotted time for this episode. So like I said, if you missed the details, please go check out that article. And I won't go into the detail in the episode I did in the article, so you're going to want to check it out regardless. So you'll recall in previous episodes and previous articles, if you've been following along, that we have looked at the symbols associated with Saturn, the deity, and the planet. Now, I had mentioned that we were going to come back and talk about some things, and this is us coming back and talking about some things. If you'll recall, I pointed out that it appeared that the ancients had some knowledge of the polar storm formations on Saturn. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons, as I'm sure you can imagine. How could the ancients know what the poles of Saturn looked like when we haven't known what the poles of Saturn looked like until the Voyager and Cassini missions, allegedly anyway? So this episode, we're going to take a look at that. And before we do that, I want to take just a couple of minutes and kind of compare the traditional view of cosmic evolution with what has been called catastrophism. Now, the traditional view that you've been taught about where the universe came from, if you went to school any time in the last 40 to 50 years, which I'm assuming is most of the audience, is associated with what is called uniformitarianism or gradualism. Now, most people listening will be more familiar with this as it pertains to geology or geological evolution and biology or biological evolution. This is the idea that the present is the key to the past and that all speciation, when it comes to biology, is a result of gradual change over time thanks to mutation, natural selection, and environmental pressures. For more on that, check out the article. With regard to geology, this is the idea that the layers of the Earth have been laid down gradually over many, many, many thousands of years, millions in fact. And I'm sure lots of you have seen the classic picture of the so-called geologic column, where you have different layers of rock associated with different periods of time and different fossils found in the rock. I could do a show series on the fallacies associated with that theory, but nonetheless, lots of people will be familiar with that sort of imagery. So I'm just using that as a point of reference. Just keep that in your mind so that you understand what I'm talking about when I say uniformitarianism or gradualism. It's the idea of gradual change over a protracted amount of time. And if you're familiar with biological evolution, the idea that life started as a single-celled organism, evolved and mutated over millions of generations to speciate and become the diverse forms of life we have today, that would be the biological equivalent. And the geological equivalent is looking at rock strata and assuming that they have been laid down gradually, one layer at a time over a vastly protracted amount of time. Now, When I say cosmic evolution, lots of people listening probably don't have a good sense of what I'm talking about. And here's the 5-minute version, hyper simplified. And I give you this as a kind of a compare and contrast for what I'm going to tell you next. So many folks have heard of the Big Bang theory, as it's been known, and I believe in the Big Bang too, but not the way scientists do. I think when God said, "Let there be," that was probably a pretty big bang. But anyway, the scientifically orthodox, or the scientific religion's version of orthodoxy, states that in the remote past, approximately 13 billion years ago, give or take, the universe seems to age millions of years per year, but that's a different conversation. About 13 billion years ago, an infinitely small, infinitely dense point exploded and gave us everything. Now, when they say gave us everything, what they really mean is this point exploded and it made a soup of hot hydrogen with that was almost uniformly spread, so there wasn't much gravitational variation. And in the mix, there were some dashes of lighter elements like lithium or beryllium or helium. And between these trace amounts of simple elements, along with slight variations in the dispersion of hydrogen atoms, you had small gravitational anomalies. These gravitational anomalies pulled in more hydrogen to themselves, eventually forming large globs of hydrogen floating in this primordial universal soup, if you like. And by virtue of their gravity and mass, eventually, the theory goes that through gravitation, there was enough heat built up in the center of these hydrogen globs to ignite and basically form the first generation of stars. And from this first generation of stars, you have other generations that spring out of them. To keep myself sane and keep this relatively short, I'm going to skip a few generations. And where we get planets is, according to the official narrative, these stars, by virtue of the heat and pressure in their cores, fused hydrogen atoms together into heavier, denser, more complex elements like carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and so on. And as the generations went on, heavier and heavier elements were formed, lead, gold, etc. When we get to a certain point, you may have a star go nova. It will explode and throw a bunch of crud out around itself. And you may be left with a white dwarf or some other variation of a star left behind that was that star's core. And within that cloud of crud thrown off by the exploding nova, you have, again, bits of stuff and dust that form globs and start going around the star and eventually form planets. Now, personally, I think that's a load of bunk, but that's the official view. I don't want to waste too much more time talking about that. I know I went through it fairly quick. If you didn't catch it, that's okay. That's all I'm going to say about it for now. Remember, I'm just telling you that so that you have something to contrast against what I'm going to tell you next. And before we get to the meat and potatoes here, I have to challenge you. Now, if you're listening to this, I'm going to say there's probably a pretty good likelihood that you're not your average sheeple. And what I mean by that is you may be somewhat conspiracy-minded. You might not necessarily trust the institutes of government and other social institutions just because somebody said you should. But there might be one thing you've overlooked here. I know I did for a lot of years. So, assuming you're of that mindset, you probably don't trust your government to tell you the truth. You probably don't trust your intelligence services to give you the truth. You probably don't trust your law enforcement to give you the truth. And you surely don't trust the entertainment industry to give you the truth. And in entertainment industry, I'm also going to lump the 6 o'clock news. You don't trust that, as you shouldn't. However, there's one organization that is seemingly above criticism, even within the demographic that would, let's say, have a bit of a questioning mind, and that is NASA. We will question the CIA's version of events with JFK. We will question the government administration and their version of events with regard to 9/11. We will question the FBI and the ATF with regard to issues like Waco or Oklahoma City. But for some reason, NASA, with some odd exceptions, basically goes above questioning. Now, moon landing conspiracies aside, generally speaking, what NASA says goes, even to those who generally don't trust the government. Now, I have a lot more detail about this in the article if you want to go check that out, but I want to ask you, why do you trust NASA? They are an organization that was formed after World War II out of a couple of other organizations, one of which being the Army Ballistic Missile Administration, and along with the different branches of the military, as well as the Naval Research Laboratory, along with those branches of the military that folded into NASA when they became an entity in the early 50s, came Nazi scientists. And if that's surprising to you, I would encourage you to look up Project Paperclip. Project Paperclip was instituted after the end of World War II by the United States government to basically bring in Nazi scientific talent to advance the American military agenda. Some of them are frankly quite famous. Wernher von Braun would be one of them. Oppenheimer, I believe, came before Paperclip, but he's another one. The rocket scientists tend to be fairly well known and somewhat famous in their own right. But what many people don't know, is that under Project Paperclip, there were literally thousands of Nazi scientists brought into the United States and basically pardoned. Many, many, many of them joined NASA through the infolding of the military when NASA was formed. Now, if you look at the logo of NASA, if that's not enough for you to distrust them, just take a look. You'll remember that we said that circles and rings represent Saturn. Well, NASA has a circle or a ring on its logo circling the letters AS. Now, they would say, wow, that's an orbiter. I would say, no, that's Saturn, and you know it is. But who cares about the two letters, right? Well, Aleister Crowley, in his seminal work, The Book of the Law, said that the black magician should learn to turn all things backwards, walk backwards, talk backwards, read backwards, etc. If you take AS and turn it backwards, you get SA. The SA were the forerunners to the SS, who were supplanted by the SS, I believe, and you'll have to check my history on this one, during the Night of the Long Knives in Germany. They were Hitler's crack troops before the SS supplanted them. And this is encoded on the NASA logo. You'll also notice on that NASA logo that there is a red chevron. That chevron, to me, looks a lot like a serpent's tongue, and that in and of itself, I don't think I need to explain. But the other way you can look at that is to make it a stylized T. And it might be a stretch, maybe not, I'll leave it up to you, but if that red serpent's tongue chevron is in fact a hidden stylized T, NASA becomes an anagram for Satan. Now, just ask yourself if you really want to be trusting that organization. Keep that in your mind. Something else I want to make you aware of as we go ahead here is that even we in the questioning mind kind of demographic are subject to two anomalies or phenomena in psychology. One is called a normalcy bias, and the other is called cognitive dissonance. A normalcy bias is the idea that if you have seen something and you've always seen it, if you've always seen item A in state number 1, and you believe that item A will always be in state number 1 because you've always seen it in state number 1, ergo it has always been in state number 1, to have somebody come along and say, yes, item A is in state number 1, but in the past, item A was in state number 2, or maybe in the future, item A will stay in state number 1, but it will become item B. That is so alien to us that we cannot compute. We cannot process this new information because it goes against our normalcy bias. We think because something has always been one way, it will always be and has always been that way. Now, this is where cognitive dissonance comes in. Cognitive dissonance is a fancy way of saying that somebody has presented you with information that contradicts a deeply held core belief in your mind, and your brain has a survival mechanism in the form of cognitive dissonance where it would rather throw out new information, even if that information is perfectly logical, well-reasoned, and verifiable. It would rather throw that information out because it contradicts your deeply held belief, that normalcy bias. It would rather throw that new information out rather than amend your belief because the new information is intellectually uncomfortable. Now, if you're aware of these two things, it's much easier to identify them when they start to happen and deal with them, both in yourself as well as with others. Everybody is subject to this. It's just the way your brain works. So bear that in mind as we move ahead here. Okay, so I said all that to get to the meat of the matter here. And the meat of the matter is that we've been sold a false bill of goods. We look up in the sky at night and we assume that all the stars and planets have always been as they are, or they have been undergoing very gradual shift for a very long time. Now, if you are of a Christian persuasion listening to this, you don't know it, maybe, but if you are a young Earth creationist, you already subscribe to part of the theory I'm about to put forward, and that theory is called catastrophism. By nature of the fact that you, as a young Earth creationist, believe in a global flood of Noah, that is an integral part of the overarching theory of catastrophism. Now, if you want to do more research on catastrophism as a whole, I'm going to focus in on one aspect here, but if you want to research it as a whole, I would highly recommend that you go to your preferred search engine or straight to YouTube and look for the Thunderbolts Project, and more specifically their documentary called Symbols of an Alien Sky. Now, that is the inspiration for the title of this episode and this article. It is a little dry and it is pretty info heavy, but if you have a mind for science, it is certainly worth checking out. They deal with catastrophism as well as the electric universe model, both of which I'm going to cover here in at least some detail. Okay. The other resource I would highly recommend you check out, and you can get this on ebook on Amazon. I did look after I wrote the article. You can find it. It is a book It is a book entitled Worlds in Collision by Immanuel Velikovsky. Velikovsky is Velikovsky. He was a relatively well-known author in the middle of the 20th century who was largely ostracized from the scientific community because of his views on catastrophism. He is the gentleman who initially turned me on to the idea of alternative history and this idea of catastrophism. Full disclosure, I am some flavor of what you would call a young Earth creationist, though not necessarily in the traditional sense. I take the Genesis account very literally. I will come back to that at the end here and tell you what I mean by that. Okay, so I'm going to run through this theory of this basic theory of catastrophism, or at least one version of it, and we're going to tie it back to Genesis at the end, and we'll see how it works with this whole Saturnalian occultism thing. Okay, so bear with me. We'll tie the timing in later. If this rankles you, just hang on. I'll explain it. Okay, so rather than assuming that our sky has always looked as it does and the planets and stars have always been in their current position, let's take a step back. Maybe the ancients told us something. I'm going to say they did. I've got some pictures of some cylinder seals and different Babylonian and Mesopotamian art on the article I'd encourage you to look at. They recorded what they saw. And when they looked up in the night sky, they saw something that we don't see today. They could literally look up and they could see Saturn with the naked eye, unaided, largely dominating the night and daytime sky at one point, along with Venus and Mars. Okay? Now, I'm going to just come out with my thesis statement here and then explain it. So in the far-flung past, Earth didn't have the sun we have today. Rather, Earth was in a polar alignment, meaning it was in a stack, if you will, with Mars, Venus, and Saturn. If you picture this in your mind, Earth is on the bottom, Mars is next up the chain, Venus is the third rung, and Saturn sits at the top. All four of these planets are rotating on a common axis. Now, before I take this too much further, I will acknowledge that in the past year, there's been a resurgence in flat Earth theory. I do not call myself a flat earther, though if you are one and you're listening to this, I know my audience can tend to be a little bit not mainstream, and I love that, so don't take this as a criticism. But if you happen to fall into that camp, don't turn off. This does work on your model. I won't call myself a flat earther, but I do know that the idea is out there, and I have to work from a globalist perspective here, or a globular Earth perspective here, for a myriad of reasons. But don't turn off. Just bear with me here. So you have these four planets stacked up along a common axis, and if you're looking at the article, I've got an artist's conception of that. When the ancients looked up in the sky, they would look up, and over the position we now have Polaris in the north sky would have been a massive ball, Saturn, essentially. Saturn didn't have rings at this point. Venus and Mars were stacked below it. Mars, it almost formed what would look like an eyeball in the sky, if you will. And surrounding this whole mess was an envelope of plasma that couldn't be seen through. Now, I said the Earth didn't have our sun. It did have a sun, though. That sun was Saturn. Scientists today, and we have to take NASA at its word, unfortunately, because we have to work with what we've got, NASA today will admit that Saturn operates more like a star than a planet. It gives off more energy than it receives. During this period in history, Saturn was the sun of the Earth. The sun as in the thing that gives light. Now, because it was in a polar alignment, it never rose and it never set. It just sat in the sky, motionless, with Venus and Mars below it and Earth at the bottom. Because it was this star, what we would call a brown dwarf, it put off and maintained this envelope of plasma around the whole system. Now, likely this plasma was somewhat luminous, which will have aided in giving Earth some light, because brown dwarf stars are not generally bright. They don't give off a whole lot of visible light. So Earth would have been dimly lit, kind of in a homogeneous sort of muddy twilight sort of way all the time. And there was no day-night cycle. Not only that, but because this plasma haze is opaque, you couldn't see the stars from the surface of Earth. So you're left with this very dreary sort of atmosphere where there's not really much to see and it's not very bright. But when you look up in the sky, you see Saturn sitting there unmoving, a large object dominating a good chunk of the sky, and Venus below it is what Velikovsky called an electric comet. I'm not sure that's necessarily completely accurate, but when you look at the depictions of the ancients, you see that they recorded something. And they recorded that Venus, this object, was highly electrically charged, and it gave off these charged plasma streamers that moved to the outside of the visible disk of Saturn. And during different points in history and during different disturbances, the number and the shape of these plasma streamers, or these arms of electric energy, changed. And you can see that if you go to the article. I've got a couple of examples of different art depicting this exact thing. Mars below it, Mars is ubiquitously associated with war, right? He's the god of war in almost every culture by different names. The Romans called him Mars, obviously. He's red, right? The planet is red. The Greeks called him Ares. The Norse called him Thor. I'm sure many listeners will be familiar with that, if only through Marvel Comics, the hammer-wielding god of war. And he's always associated with violence. Now, within this system, it was highly electrically charged, hence the electric plasma coming off of Venus. Venus was probably the most independently electrically active item in this whole arrangement. Now, what will have happened is that because you have charged bodies in relatively close proximity, you have plasma or electroplasmic discharge between the different heavenly bodies, including the Earth, okay? So you have static, for lack of a better term, jumping, like when you touch somebody and give them an electric shock from Earth to Mars, or Mars to Earth, or Mars to Venus, or vice versa. And the ancients record this in some cases. I'm not going to say all myth is down to this. Some catastrophists would tell you that. I won't. But they did record this. You see sky battles between the gods and a cosmic struggle of the gods in the sky, and you have Zeus's lightning bolts and so on. Maybe a good place to look at this would be Zoroastrianism, where you have Ahura Mazda doing battle in the sky with the angry spirit, whose Persian name that just flew out of my head here. They have these cosmic sky battles. And this is these planets discharging energy back and forth. The other thing is, in this system, because everything is so electrically charged and interacting, when these plasma streamers would come down to Earth, they follow something called a Birkeland current. I'll let you look that up on your own. Very interesting. But you have these plasma streamers that would come down and touch Earth. And they could stay there for some amount of time, kind of sitting there, maybe going through different permutations of shape and color. This is where you get references to, stairways to heaven, or what the ancients would call the axis mundi, the navel of the world, where heaven meets earth, where the gods come and touch the surface of the planet, right? And this went on for some time. In fact, this went on probably up until the time of the flood, but we'll come back to that. But this system obviously didn't stay this way. And like I said, for more info on how this all worked, please read my article. Also check out the Thunderbolts project. But anyway, for brevity's sake, I got to keep moving. So this didn't stay this way indefinitely. Obviously, all you have to do is look out the window and you can see that. So at some point, as this system moved through space, according to one interpretation anyway, it encountered the sun we have today. And when this plasma sheath that was blocking out the stars electrically interacted with the heliosphere of the sun we have now, the plasma sheath collapsed. Suddenly, from the perspective of the Earth, you can see stars. Now, depending who you read after, this whole system may have fallen into an orbit around our current sun relatively intact. Now, through some catastrophic interactions between other heavenly bodies, partially our sun, possibly something to do with Jupiter, the system was disturbed a few times, as a matter of fact, but one time in particular was where we see the formation of Saturn's rings. Some people will tell you that Saturn literally birthed another planet out of itself during one of these interactions, but it seems pretty clear to me that Saturn at some point was interacted with in a catastrophic way, which caused it to throw off debris. That debris became the rings we see today. Now, who cares? Well, this ring system will have caused a very interesting effect from the perspective of a person or an entity standing on the surface of Earth. Remember, you can still look up and you can see Venus and Mars in front of Saturn forming this weird kind of cosmic eyeball with plasma streamers and lightning bolts and the whole nine yards. But now you can see the stars, and now, because you've fallen into orbit around our current sun, you also have a day-night cycle. So the other thing here, well, let me back up. You'll recall in our previous episodes, we talked about how Saturn is the god of time. The Greeks called him Chronos. That's where we get, chronometer, chronic, that sort of thing. Saturn is the god of time. Now, why would Saturn be the god of time if when he ruled with this, plasma-encompassed system, if there was no measurement of time because there was no passage of day and night, and there was no way to measure years because you couldn't see the stars? Why is Saturn the god of time? Excuse me. Well, here's why. When you would stand on Earth, you now have a day-night cycle. Okay, so for the first time, there is a tangible, easily observable way to measure the passage of days. The other thing is you now have access, or visual access at least, to the stars. So you can now measure years. It would be my opinion that there were still no definable seasons at this point. Why that is, maybe I can talk about some other time. But you have now a way to measure years and days. The other thing is you now have this gigantic ring system around Saturn that's still easily visible from Earth and now dominates even more of the sky thanks to these rings. From the perspective of Earth, okay, standing on the ground, looking up at the sky, you see the sun traverse the sky. It will be illuminating the near side of Saturn's rings. From your perspective, as the sun is moving across the sky, an illuminated crescent of light is reflected off of Saturn's rings, so you get this crescent of light following the sun around. Now, because these rings are so big, and thanks to the perspective that you have on the Earth, even after the sun goes down, it passes the horizon, it can be the middle of the night, and most likely, if you look up at Saturn in the sky and its rings, you will still see the illuminated crescent on the ring, even though the sun is down and the sky is relatively dark. So what you have now is you have a crescent of light running laps around the rings of Saturn on a 24-hour cycle. Now, I'd almost bet you money you don't look at the clock hands, or you don't look at the hands on your clock going around every 24 hours the same way again. Your circular clock face, indirectly at least, will owe some of its lineage to this. Now, this becomes where Saturn is associated with time, because you now essentially have a gigantic cosmic clock in the sky running laps around Saturn, okay? The other thing I should note here, I know in the previous episode I kind of left you hanging when I said El, or Elohim, was associated with Saturn. We're going to come back to that, maybe in the next episode. We're not going to come back to it yet. One thing I will point out, though, is because Saturn was the top of this celestial stack, Saturn, as the deity and the planet, was referred to as the Most High God, as in literally the highest on the stack, okay? We'll come back to that, like I said, along with the Elohim thing. So you now have time, measurable, observable, and basically Saturn-centric in this system. So still, again, this system didn't last. Look out the window, it's self-evident. So something else disturbed the system here. And again, this may be a Jupiter thing, probably some more to do with our sun. At some point, the system was disturbed to the point where Saturn and Mars flew off and found orbits similar, though not necessarily identical to the ones we see today. And Venus was really messed up, and it got flung off in an orbit similar to a comet, where it swings close to the sun and then flies way out for many decades and then comes back. The exact time period for the cycle is debated all over the place, but it worked like a comet. You had this widely elliptical orbit. Now, okay, so now, let me back up. Sorry, I'm all over the map here. According to a vaguely Velikovskian interpretation of this, Venus remained a comet-like body until relatively recently, in fact, sometime probably around the first millennium BC. At some time around that period in history, it theoretically nearly collided with Mars on its way back around the sun. When this happened, Mars, there was again massive electrical disturbances between the planets as they tried to equalize their respective charges. This would have been visible from Earth. Mars will have been pushed into its stable orbit we see now, and Venus will have been bounced into the stable orbit we see now as well. Hence the end of the age of catastrophe, if you will. So that kind of brings us up to our current day arrangement. And I know this is very brief and I'm glossing over all the details, but I have to just for brevity's sake. So how does this fit into Genesis? Well, if you look at Genesis, verse 1, you see that God created the heaven and the earth. God creates all things perfect. So then why in Genesis 1 verse 2 is everything laid waste, as the ASV puts it? Well, that's because before Genesis 1 verse 2, there was a rebellion, probably angelic, and that angelic race likely ruled the planet. This is what is called the Luciferian rebellion. This is why Lucifer or Satan was already fallen by the time of the garden. This is why God poured out judgment on the earth before humanity was here. This is called vaguely gap theory. I don't agree with all of gap theory. Look it up. You make your own decision. But to me, it is fairly obvious that there were people here before us. Maybe not people, maybe angelic. There was a race here. Jeremiah talks about cities and people and animals before Adam in a vision. Isaiah mentions it no less than twice, and so on. So this whole thing, this dark world, this would be the pre-Adamic earth. Genesis, where God says, "Let there be light," my opinion is this was the miraculous rather than gradual introduction of our sun. Stripped away the plasma sheath, disturbed the rings of Saturn, so on and so forth. This is where you get, the evening and the morning were the first day. Literally, it was the first day Earth had seen. So from there, we've got day-night cycle, we've got the rings running laps of light. Then this is the state where Adam and Eve are introduced. And essentially, this is the state of this system, in my opinion, probably until around the time of the flood. At the time of the flood, this system was disturbed again, and this is where Mars and Saturn are sent off to similar orbits they have today, and Venus is ejected. So now, after the flood, Venus is on this elliptical orbit that comes around every couple of decades. Many catastrophists will tell you that every single miraculous event recorded in every single religious text the world over can be explained by the catastrophic interaction of Venus with Earth. I don't buy that. But there almost certainly was catastrophic interactions between Venus and Earth. And these would have taken the form, two different sorts of forms. Number one is electrogravitic, and this would be, a standard catastrophist would kind of say that Well, you have a phenomenon like Jacob's long day, which, according to Velikovsky's book, the natives of the Americas recorded a long night, which presumably was the same period in time as Joshua's long day. This is Venus coming around and stopping the Earth's spin through its gravity and electromagnetic influence. Interesting theory. I see a lot of problems with it. You do your own homework and make up your own mind. I don't like that one. You can make up your own. You can make your own decision on that one. Then you will see that because Venus is cometary in nature, it leaves a debris trail. When comets come by today, we see this. We travel through the tail of the comet and we see a light show. We get a bunch of shooting stars. Though in Venus's case, it's much larger than your average comet, and the tail, theoretically, was much dirtier. It was loaded with hydrocarbons, sulfur, phosphorus, other noxious elements, as well as large chunks of rock and stone, essentially. You know, everything from sand-sized up to maybe a Volkswagen. So this gets blamed. This is the explanation given for events, say, of the Old Testament period where God burnt and blasted Sennacherib's army with hot rocks from the sky, or the flaming hail of the plagues of Egypt. Now, this may have been a contributing factor. I will grant it that. But I don't think it's an adequate explanation for all of the miraculous events of the Old Testament. Having said that, I do think this did happen in the past. And what I mean by this, when I say this happened, is that when Earth traveled through the cometary tail of Venus, you have now this planet passing through this debris field that is loaded with hydrocarbons, other flammable material, and rock. When this mixes with the atmosphere, you now have hydrocarbons, which are highly flammable, think like gasoline, sulfur, like a match head, phosphorus, like a match head, okay, coming into an oxygen-rich atmosphere, like we have today, so they are primed and ready to burn. Now, you also have pebble-sized, rock-sized, boulder-sized rocks falling through the atmosphere with these gases and hydrocarbons at incredible velocity, making enormous amounts of friction-driven heat. So what you're left with is a soupy mix of phosphorus, sulfur, and hydrocarbons coming into an oxygen-rich environment, falling to Earth along with 1,000-degree spark plugs. What does that give you? That gives you fire and brimstone, literally. And I have little doubt in my mind that this happened in actual history. Does it explain all the catastrophic events of the Old Testament? No, I do not believe it does. Nor do I believe it explains all of the events in the Indian Vedas or the Popol Vuh or whatever. But I'm sure it was a contributing factor in some way. So, now, that kind of runs down in a really abbreviated sort of way the events or the ideas behind catastrophism and where they fit in the biblically endorsed historical narrative, if you will. Is this the way history happened? I tend to think it probably is. Having said that, I'll leave it up to you. Now, who cares? Why do we even talk about this? Well, remember at the top of the show, we talked about how the ancients somehow knew what Saturn's poles look like. Well, now, if you reject this theory and you go with your preconceived idea of the night sky, you have to somehow account for the fact that the ancients knew what the poles of Saturn looked like. Now, there's kind of a few options you have here. Number one is the option of catastrophism, as I've just described it. I like that theory. Option two is, or would appeal to those of, let's say, an ancient alien persuasion, saying that aliens told the ancients. I don't like that theory. I would say if there was non-human intervention in humanity's past, it was not extraplanetary in the alien sense so much as it was extra-dimensional in the fallen angelic sense. Okay, so I'll give them that one, but I won't give them the little green men from Mars. The other two ideas you can deal with here are that the ancients had optics that were vastly superior to ours, with computing power capable of sorting out all of the various optical challenges of peering through our murky, thermally dynamic, moisture and particulate-filled atmosphere to see Saturn millions of miles away. I don't buy it. Reason being, we can't do it today. I know the ancients had high tech, but their version of high tech looked very different than our version of high tech. And I just, based on my understanding of the ancients' technology, I don't see it as plausible. We can't do it today, not to say they couldn't do it, but I don't think they would have. I don't think it was practical. I think they had better things to do. The other option is that the ancients launched satellites, essentially, or weather balloon carried cameras and either had a data link or picked up a storage thing that fell back to Earth after re-entry. Don't like that either. I think it's impractical. I think the ancients had better things to do. I think they were smarter than that, frankly. I'm not even completely convinced that the images we're given of our cosmos are legit or if they're just CGI, but that's a whole other issue. So if you reject this view of history, you are forced to admit basically one of those three other options, unless you've got a better idea. I'd love to hear it if you do, but frankly, all things considered, I think catastrophism is likely the most reasonable candidate, especially in view of Genesis. The difference in Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Right? The other thing, this is just a little aside, and we're kind of going to shut her down here. Something I want you to consider is when I was revisiting gap theory, as I was doing this article, something dawned on me I'd never noticed before. The presence of the water, when it says that God's Spirit moved across the face of the great deep, the presence of the water is never explained. Think about it. The water is there, but there's no explanation given for its presence. I'm not going to say I have an answer for that, but just noodle it. And I'm also going to say, just on the way out here, that given the amount of headache and struggle I've had putting this article and this show together, losing hours of work because of mysterious technical glitches, I have to assume that some fallen spiritual entities really don't want this information out. And that being the case, for all the blood, sweat, and tears this one has taken me, I would ask that if you haven't already, please share this audio, the article. Share it to whoever you can, whoever you're brave enough to send it to, frankly, because I really think that there is information here that the dark side does not want exposed. And we are really going to start getting into right down to the brass tacks in the next couple of weeks here. We're kind of done with the whole setup. Now we're going to start moving into the application, how this Saturnian stuff ties into the spirit realm and the global conspiracy and so on and so forth. So prepare yourselves. If you thought this was wild, we're going to kick it up another notch next time around. I'm not sure if it'll be next week or the week following. I've got some work to do. But please share this content. I know there's been a lot of resistance to this in the physical and the spiritual. So get it out, share it out, and if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, I would love to hear it. And with that, I will leave you. Blessings.